Hello again. Right, so as promised, I'm going to be starting on classification and taxonomy, which is the first part of my course. So, got a few graphics I'm going to try and throw in, and the object of this chapter is to try and understand how plants are actually classified. So what you need to understand is there is the very basic prehistoric type of plants like mosses, liverworts, hornworts. They're known as the bryophytes, if I pronounce that correctly. Now they are probably the most basic plants, and probably been with us since the dawn of time. And they're basically plants that have no conductive tissue. So effectively, if you can see what a moss looks like, there is no sort of vessels where water will travel through. And in the evolutionary chain, they are the most basic plant that's around. Then we've got another classification of plant type known as some of these are very difficult. Coelagenellas. And these are a step up from the bryophytes. They're plants with conductive tissue, but they still don't have true leaves, so that's what sets them apart. And then we roll over to plants with conductive tissues. So this is plants now that are able to transport water through itself to feed itself, and these plants will have true leaves, proper leaves. And that's basically where we will start from. The bryophytes and the coelagenellas are not part of the course, and we're now dealing with plants that have conductive tissue and true leaves. Now they come in three different categories as well. We've got ferns, and again, ferns is something that's not been studied on the course. But then there are two very important types. There's the Genusperms and the Angiosperms. Okay, so to deal with Genusperms to start with, you need to think of conifers. Now, as my graphic will show, within that, the word gymnosperm, if I got that correct, gymno is Greek for naked, and sperma is Greek for seed. So basically, if you think of conifers, they don't produce fruit. They produce their seed in a cone, and that's the actual seed that is visible. So the seed is not enclosed in a case. It's the tree or the plant will actually produce its offspring directly. So if you can imagine again, ferns growing on conifers and trees. They're only pollinated through the wind, so effectively when they fall off, they're blown off the tree, and they just start growing wherever they land. Typically these type of plants, like conifers for example, the gymnosperms are often found in dry habitats. So if you go into dense woodland areas where there's lots of conifers, you'll actually see that the ground is very dry. They have resinous tissue, so that's sort of sticky sap. And they also have a simple vascular system, using only tracheids. Now, tracheids are elongated cells in the xylem of vascular plants that serve in the transport of water and mineral salts. So that's gymnosperms. Then we've got Angiosperms, and this is pretty much where the course is going to be based mainly on, because this is flowering plants. So they produce fruit, and the seeds are within the fruit. They're pollinated not just by the wind, but with insects also. The offspring that it produces is via an embryo sac, so effectively that's what the fruit is. But they have a much more complex vascular system. So if you think of a leaf now on something typical, maybe a chili plant or a tomato plant, and you look at the veins in that leaf, it's a far more complex system. Now moving down from that, the angiosperms are actually split into two different types. So we've got monocotyledons, or monocots, and the dicotyledons, the dicots. So starting with monocots. Now, the embryos, is one seed leaf usually. Now, if you think of, when we say seed leaf, that's the cotyledon actually, and mono being just one. The cotyledon, so if you've ever grown a seed and you've then got a very small plant called a seedling, it hasn't actually matured yet, you'll have the, with tomatoes for example, you'll have two little leaves that it starts off growing. Those eventually drop off and you start to get the adult leaves. So those leaves are known as the cotyledon. And so when a seed grows, if it's just the one leaf that it starts to produce, that's typical of a monocotyledon. The roots are short-lived primary roots, but then form into complex arrangements of a root system. Leaves are usually parallel, veined, long, sort of oblong shape. The growth form, they're mainly herbaceous, very few are tree-like. The vascular system, now the vascular bundles scattered randomly, no defined cortex or stele, and no cambium. Flowers usually come in groups of threes or just in threes. Now the pollen is a single furrow. Lignification. Now that's the strengthening of the plant vascular body. So has it got the ability to like a tree would actually grow bark? It would actually start off at very its stem would start off green, very easy to break, but then over time it gets thicker and thicker, and then produce a more of a woody structure. That's what lignification is, the strengthening of the plant vascular body. And with monocotyledons, or monocots, they have none, they don't do that. And we've got the dicots. Now the dicots have, as I said, they have two seed leaves, and sometimes some endosperm. Now, I won't tell what endosperm is because it doesn't tell you in the coursework, but it's typically the if you take a coconut for example, it's the white stuff that's in the coconut. It's actually what the young plant feeds from before it starts to sort of grow into a plant. Roots, you get tap roots with these, with dicots. So it's one big root that goes all the way down into the ground, but then you get all these little lateral roots coming out from it. Leaves, very complex, reticulate veins, usually quite broad. So effectively, that if you just take an oak leaf, for example, and have a look at it and see how complex the veins are, that's typical of dicots. The growth form, herbaceous or woody. So they, quite typically a dicot could eventually mature and have quite a woody branches on it. The vascular system develops from primary bundles to form a ring within the cambium. So like a cross section of an oak tree, you see the rings. Well, that's typical of dicots. That's how they form. Flowers usually 4s or 5s, and the pollen is 3 furrows. And lignification, yes, it has that. So as you see with trees, for example, typically with dicotyledon, you'll see that a lot of plants will actually get quite woody. So that's the difference, that's the basic breakdown of the classification of plants. Now, give you some examples of monocots: bamboo, onion, grass, most alliums, or all alliums, sorry, and daffodils. And then we've got dicots. So if you think about it, if you've ever grown seeds, you actually see those 2 initial leaves that start off first. That's the cotyledons. And if there's 2, it's a dicot. So you've got lettuce, tomato, salvias, aubergines, parsley. There's hundreds I could rattle off, but the course only required me to come up with 5 for each. And that's the first part of my course, which is classification and taxonomy. Now there's been some photographs that I've been showing. They're available on a website called freeimages.com. I do have to throw that in because that's part of the deal of giving them credit. And also I would draw your attention to my Patreon website, which is patreon.com/Mansell MANSELNOTT. Have a look at that, because I'm encouraging all people that have an interest in what I'm doing to become my patron. And effectively, even if it's just $1 a month, that'll go towards the project that I've set out to eventually achieve, which is going to be a day centre for people with learning difficulties and various mental health issues, etc. So all patrons are welcome, and I thank you for my first contribution to this project. Okay, thank you very much.